Hey guys, tonight we're diving into some of the worst tasting recipes ever proudly served during the Middle Ages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you happen to receive an invitation to a royal banquet in medieval England, you might imagine glittering silver plates loaded with roasted swans, fragrant pastries, and beautifully carved venison. Instead, one of the evening's greatest delicacies might arrive looking as though the castle chef had wandered down to the river, lost a bet, and decided to bake the loser into a pie. Meet the lamprey. Calling it a fish is technically correct, but only in the same way that calling a hurricane a bit windy is technically correct. The lamprey is a long, eel-like creature with no jaws and a perfectly round mouth lined with rows of tiny teeth. It has spent hundreds of millions of years refusing to become more visually appealing. Evolution looked at it several times and apparently concluded, good enough. To modern eyes, it resembles something designed by a sleep-deprived blacksmith after eating questionable mushrooms. To medieval nobles, however, it was luxury. Lampreys were especially prized in the rivers of England and northern France. They were difficult to catch, seasonal, and expensive enough that serving them instantly announced your wealth. If you could place a lamprey pie before your guests, you weren't simply offering dinner. You were politely informing everyone that your bank account was healthier than theirs. Kings adored them. Bishops requested them. Even monasteries occasionally enjoyed them when fortune smiled upon the kitchen. The meat itself was surprisingly rich, far fattier than most fish. Medieval cooks naturally looked at this already heavy ingredient and decided the obvious solution was to make it considerably heavier. After cleaning the lamprey, they simmered the meat in red wine with vinegar, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, pepper, onions, raisins, and other expensive spices before sealing everything inside a thick pastry crust. The finished pie looked magnificent. It also contained enough richness to make butter quietly wonder if perhaps things had gone a little too far. And then there was the blood. Rather than discarding it, many recipes mixed the lamprey's blood into the sauce to create a deeper colour and richer flavour. Modern television cooking competitions often celebrate using every part of the animal. Medieval cooks heard that philosophy centuries early and interpreted it with remarkable enthusiasm. The lamprey's most famous admirer was King Henry I. According to medieval chroniclers, his physicians repeatedly warned him not to eat so many lampreys. Whether they feared indigestion, food poisoning, or simply wanted their king to survive another winter, we cannot say for certain. Henry, however, seems to have treated medical advice the way many people treat the terms and conditions before installing software. He ignored it. In the year 1135, after reportedly enjoying a generous meal of lampreys, the king fell gravely ill and died shortly afterward. Today, historians are careful not to blame the pie entirely. He may have suffered from food poisoning, another illness, or a combination of factors unrelated to his favourite meal. Medieval medicine was not exactly famous for controlled clinical trials. If someone sneezed near a comet while eating fish on a Tuesday, there was a decent chance all three would end up being blamed. Still, the story endured because it was simply too good not to repeat. A mighty king brought low, not by an invading army or a palace conspiracy, but by repeatedly saying, "One more slice won't hurt." Whether or not the lamprey actually caused his death, it certainly earned one of history's most memorable culinary reputations. The remarkable thing is that medieval diners genuinely loved this dish. They saw elegance where we see nightmare fuel. To them, Lamprey pie represented wealth, refinement, and sophisticated taste. To us, it looks like someone accidentally baked a vampire's lunch into pastry and served it with complete confidence. And somehow, this is only the beginning. By the end of tonight's feast, you may find yourself looking at plain boiled vegetables with a newfound sense of gratitude. After surviving a royal helping of lamprey pie, you might reasonably assume medieval cuisine would begin to improve. Instead, it somehow became more confusing. One of the strangest beliefs to circulate through medieval Europe involved a bird called the barnacle goose. The mystery was simple enough. Every autumn, great flocks of these geese appeared in Britain and Ireland, yet nobody had ever seen them nesting locally. Their breeding grounds were thousands of miles away in the Arctic, a place medieval Europeans knew very little about. When faced with a missing piece of information, medieval scholars did what humans have always done throughout history. They confidently invented one. According to a surprisingly popular theory, barnacle geese did not hatch from eggs at all. Instead, they supposedly grew from strange shellfish called goose barnacles that clung to pieces of floating driftwood. Over time, tiny birds were believed to develop inside the shells before dropping into the sea and flying away as fully formed geese. If this sounds ridiculous, remember that nobody could simply search for "where do barnacle geese nest?" The nearest search engine was an elderly monk who had once spoken to a fisherman whose cousin claimed to know someone who had definitely seen it happen. Illustrations from medieval manuscripts even show little geese hanging from pieces of wood, like ripe fruit waiting for harvest. Naturally, people began asking an important question. If these birds came from shellfish instead of ordinary animals, were they technically meat? For many medieval Christians, especially during fasting seasons like Lent, eating meat from land animals was forbidden. Fish, however, remained perfectly acceptable. Since barnacle geese supposedly originated in the sea, several regions concluded that eating them during fast days was completely reasonable. One suspects the geese themselves were never consulted on this theological loophole. Cookbooks described roasting the birds with herbs, onions, vinegar, and rich sauces, much like any other goose. The flavour itself was probably excellent. Wild goose is still enjoyed today. What tasted unpleasant, however, was the medieval habit of combining the rich meat with powerful vinegars, excessive spices, and sweet ingredients like raisins or prunes in the same dish. Medieval cooks adored mixing sour, sweet, salty, and spicy flavours until your tongue simply gave up trying to identify what was happening. It was less a recipe and more an organised negotiation between competing ingredients. Eventually, explorers reached the Arctic nesting grounds and discovered the truth. Barnacle geese reproduced exactly like every other sensible bird by laying eggs. An entire culinary tradition built upon spontaneous tree-grown geese quietly collapsed. Still, you have to admire the medieval imagination. Presented with a migratory mystery, they invented one of history's most entertaining biological theories and then celebrated their scientific breakthrough by putting gravy on it. By now, you've probably noticed that medieval cooks had a remarkable talent for taking perfectly edible ingredients and asking, how can we make this significantly more challenging? Their answer, quite often, was salt. Lots of it. Salted herring became one of the most common foods across northern Europe during the Middle Ages. Every autumn, enormous schools of herring filled the North Sea and the Baltic. Fishermen caught millions of them, and merchants quickly realised there was a fortune to be made if the fish could survive long journeys inland. Without refrigeration, there was only one reliable solution: bury the fish in enough salt to preserve it for months. Freshly caught herring were cleaned, layered inside large wooden barrels, and buried beneath mountains of coarse sea salt. The salt drew moisture from the flesh, preventing bacteria from growing, and allowing the fish to travel hundreds of miles. By the time a barrel reached a market in Central Europe, the herring inside had become astonishingly durable. Some probably qualified as building materials. The fish remained edible for months, sometimes even a year. That was the good news. The bad news was that every bite contained approximately half the North Sea. Before cooking, families usually soaked the herring in buckets of fresh water for an entire day. Wealthier households sometimes changed the water several times in hopes of removing more salt. Poorer families often lacked the luxury of wasting fresh water, so the fish simply stayed enthusiastic. Even after soaking, the first bite could leave your mouth feeling as though you had accidentally swallowed a wave. Medieval cooks tried everything to improve the flavour. They simmered herring with onions, mustard, parsley, vinegar and wine. Some recipes added raisins, apples or honey in an attempt to balance the saltiness. Others covered the fish with strong sauces packed with pepper, cinnamon, cloves and ginger. This was not because medieval people disliked spices. It was because they were desperately negotiating peace between the fish and their taste buds. Salted herring became especially important during Lent and the many religious fast days observed throughout the year. Depending on the calendar, Christians could spend well over 100 days annually avoiding meat. Fish therefore became an essential source of protein, and herring was cheap enough to feed everyone from peasants to monks. Monasteries often purchased entire wagon loads of salted fish before winter arrived. Imagine spending months copying illuminated manuscripts by candlelight while eating salted herring 3 or 4 times a week. Suddenly, those vows of silence begin to make perfect sense. Despite its overpowering flavour, herring helped sustain medieval Europe. It fed armies, supplied growing cities, and supported an enormous international trade network, stretching from Scandinavia to Italy. People tolerated the taste because the alternative was simple. Hunger rarely complains about seasoning. Still, after your 5th consecutive meal of salty fish, even the most devoted medieval diner may have found themselves dreaming of something truly exotic. Like plain bread. After surviving salted herring, you might hope medieval dinner would finally offer something comforting. It did. Unfortunately, comfort and excitement are not always close friends. Few dishes appeared on medieval tables more often than pottage. It was the everyday meal of peasants, craftsmen, monks, and even many nobles when grand feasts were not being held. If medieval Europe had a national dish, this thick stew would be a very strong candidate, and among its many variations, black pottage earned a particularly intimidating reputation. The name sounds like something brewed by a villain in a fairy tale, but it simply referred to the stew's dark colour. Long cooking, dark grains, leafy vegetables, onions, beans, and occasionally animal blood or dark broth could turn the mixture nearly black. It looked less like dinner, and more like a suspicious patch of swamp that had somehow found its way into your bowl. The ingredients depended entirely on what happened to be available. Cabbage, leeks, turnips, peas, barley, old bread, sometimes beans, sometimes oats, sometimes all of them at once. The remarkable thing about pottage was that it never truly ended. A large iron pot hung over the household fire day and night. Each morning, more vegetables were tossed in. Whatever remained from yesterday stayed exactly where it was. If someone caught a rabbit, pieces went into the pot. If a chicken stopped laying eggs permanently, into the pot it went. If nothing new appeared that day, everyone simply enjoyed yesterday's stew, now with the added complexity that only another 24 hours of boiling can provide. You could almost think of it as medieval meal preparation. Except instead of storing leftovers in the refrigerator, they stored them over an open fire. Continuously. for days. The longer the stew simmered, the thicker it became. Bread was often stirred in to stretch the meal further, producing a consistency somewhere between soup and mortar. It filled empty stomachs exceptionally well. It was just not especially memorable on the tongue. Seasoning posed another challenge. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves and saffron were expensive imports reserved for wealthy households. Ordinary families relied on herbs from their gardens, parsley, sage, thyme or dill, along with onions and garlic to provide flavour. When the herbs ran out, optimism became the primary seasoning. Interestingly, medieval physicians approved of pottage. According to the medical theory of the four humours, warm cooked foods were easier to digest than many raw ingredients. A slowly simmered stew was considered wholesome and balanced, making it an ideal daily meal. Modern nutritionists might even agree with parts of that assessment, just perhaps not after the stew had celebrated its 4th consecutive birthday in the same cooking pot. Black pottage was never intended to impress dinner guests. It existed for one simple purpose: keeping people alive through hard winters, poor harvests, and long days of labour. And to be fair, it succeeded brilliantly. It simply did so while convincing generations of medieval Europeans that variety was something other families probably enjoyed. If medieval cooks had one guiding philosophy, it was this: if a food could be boiled, it would be boiled. If it could be boiled long enough to become gelatin, even better. That brings us to one of the more unusual dishes to survive from medieval kitchens: jellied eels. Eels were everywhere. Rivers, marshes, ponds and estuaries across Europe teemed with them. They were easy to catch, surprisingly nutritious, and unlike many fish, they remained alive for quite some time after being removed from the water. This made transporting them to markets much easier. The unfortunate side effect was that medieval fish markets occasionally looked as though the merchandise was attempting a coordinated escape. Once caught, the eels were skinned, chopped into sections, and simmered slowly with onions, herbs, vinegar, and sometimes white wine. During the long cooking process, something interesting happened. The bones and skin naturally released collagen. As the broth cooled, it transformed into a firm jelly that surrounded every piece of fish. Modern chefs would describe this as perfectly natural. Modern diners would probably describe it as emotionally challenging. Imagine lifting a spoonful of what appears to be transparent meat-flavoured jelly, only to discover an eel hiding inside like an unpleasant surprise from the river itself. Texture mattered enormously in medieval cuisine. Wealthy households loved foods that demonstrated culinary skill, and turning liquid into a shimmering jelly impressed guests. A clear, well-set aspic showed patience, technique, and access to quality ingredients. Today, if your fish arrives wobbling across the plate, most people assume something has gone terribly wrong. Medieval nobles applauded. The flavour itself was often surprisingly mild. Vinegar added sharpness, parsley and sage contributed freshness, while pepper and ginger provided warmth. Yet the overwhelming memory for many modern eaters isn't the taste, it's the sensation. Every bite seems unable to decide whether it wishes to be soup, fish, or dessert. It settles for becoming none of them. Not everyone enjoyed eel equally. Some regions prized it above almost every other freshwater fish, while others considered it a meal of necessity. During religious fasts, however, eel became particularly valuable because it counted as fish, allowing Christians to avoid forbidden meat without sacrificing much-needed protein. Monasteries often maintained carefully managed eel ponds, ensuring a reliable food supply throughout the year. Medieval monks copied sacred manuscripts by day and occasionally rewarded themselves with a generous serving of wobbling river gelatin by evening. History rarely mentions that part. To be fair, eel remains popular in many parts of the world today, especially when grilled or smoked. The medieval version simply chose a preparation method that emphasized every texture modern diners usually try very hard to avoid. Still, compared with some recipes waiting ahead, jellied eels were almost elegant. At least you could usually identify what animal you were eating. That will not always be the case. After several courses featuring fish, jelly, and enough salt to preserve a small kingdom, perhaps a simple vegetable soup sounds refreshing. Allow medieval garlic pottage to change your mind. Garlic was one of the most dependable ingredients in the medieval kitchen. It was cheap, easy to grow, survived harsh winters, and, according to physicians, possessed nearly miraculous healing powers. If you had a cough, eat garlic. If you had a fever, eat garlic. If you had poor digestion, eat garlic. If your neighbour had a fever, apparently you should also eat garlic, just to stay ahead of the situation. By the Middle Ages, garlic had earned a reputation as nature's medicine cabinet. It also had another remarkable quality. Nobody wanted to stand close enough to argue with someone who had just eaten a large bowl of it. Garlic pottage was a humble dish, particularly common among peasants, monks, labourers, and travellers. The recipe itself was wonderfully simple. Whole bulbs of garlic were peeled and simmered alongside onions, leeks, herbs, stale bread, and vegetable or meat broth. Sometimes eggs were stirred in to make the soup richer. Wealthier households occasionally added cream or cheese, while poorer families considered themselves fortunate if they had enough bread to thicken the pot. The result was filling, inexpensive, and astonishingly aromatic. Not aromatic in the modern sense of pleasantly fragrant, more in the sense that your arrival could be detected several minutes before you actually entered the room. Medieval cooks often boiled the garlic until it became soft enough to dissolve into the broth. This mellowed some of its sharpness, creating a creamy texture and surprisingly rich flavour. Herbs such as parsley, sage, thyme, or hyssop rounded out the soup, while vinegar occasionally added a pleasant sour note. On a cold winter evening, the pottage was genuinely comforting. The following morning, however, everyone within conversational distance became unwilling participants. Medical writers praised garlic enthusiastically. Influenced by the ancient teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, medieval physicians believed garlic warmed the body, improved circulation, aided digestion, and helped drive away harmful vapours thought to spread disease. During outbreaks of illness, many people deliberately increased the amount of garlic they consumed. Whether it actually prevented disease remains uncertain. It almost certainly prevented close social interaction. Monasteries frequently cultivated garlic in their herb gardens, and recipes appear throughout medieval household manuals. Unlike saffron or imported cinnamon, garlic belonged to everyone. Kings might dine on peacocks covered in gold leaf, but even they occasionally relied on the same humble bulb growing in a peasant's garden. It was one of the rare ingredients that ignored social class completely. Modern versions of garlic soup can be wonderfully delicate and balanced. Medieval garlic pottage, however, believed moderation was a personal weakness. If one clove was beneficial, 12 could only improve matters. It was a philosophy shared by remarkably few dinner companions. Still, after a lifetime of salted fish, black pottage and jellied eels, perhaps a bowl of garlic soup wasn't such a terrible bargain. At least this meal looked like soup. That was becoming less and less guaranteed as medieval dining continued. If you thought salted herring sounded difficult to eat, medieval merchants had another seafood specialty waiting patiently on the shelf. Very patiently. Stockfish was, quite literally, fish-dried until it became almost as hard as wood. Usually made from Atlantic cod caught off the coasts of Norway and Iceland, stockfish wasn't salted at all. Instead, fishermen cleaned the fish, removed the heads, tied them together by the tails, and hung them on enormous wooden racks where cold northern winds slowly dried them over several months. The freezing temperatures did most of the work. Moisture gradually disappeared, while the flesh hardened into something remarkably durable. By the time the process was finished, the fish no longer resembled dinner. It resembled a plank. Merchants loved stockfish because it solved nearly every transportation problem. It weighed far less than fresh fish, could survive years without spoiling if kept dry, and travelled across Europe in enormous quantities. Ships carried it to England, Germany, France, Italy, and beyond, making it one of medieval Europe's most valuable exports. It was essentially the canned food of the Middle Ages. Except cans are generally easier to chew. Before anyone could eat stockfish, however, it had to be brought back to life. The dried fish was soaked in cold water for 2 or sometimes 3 days. The water needed changing regularly as the cod slowly absorbed moisture. Wealthy households often assigned servants specifically to manage this process. Imagine explaining your profession today. So, what do you do for a living? I watch fish become less solid. Even after days of soaking, the cod often remained remarkably firm. Medieval cooks boiled it for hours before serving it with butter, mustard, onions, garlic, or thick sauces made from wine and herbs. Some recipes shredded the meat into stews or pies, while others beat it with wooden mallets to soften the stubborn fibres. If your dinner requires carpentry tools, perhaps dinner has become overly ambitious. Stockfish appeared frequently during Lent and other religious fasts when meat was forbidden. Monasteries purchased vast quantities because it stored so well. Entire communities relied on it during long winters when fresh food became scarce. Nobody claimed it was exciting. It was simply dependable. Contemporary accounts suggest the flavour itself was mild, but the texture divided opinions even then. Properly prepared stockfish could become pleasantly flaky. Poorly prepared stockfish retained a determination that bordered on personal insult. One bite reminded you that this fish had survived Arctic winds for months. It wasn't about to surrender quietly to your teeth. Despite its reputation, stockfish helped feed medieval Europe for centuries. It supported international trade, enriched Scandinavian kingdoms, and prevented countless people from going hungry during difficult seasons. Still, somewhere in a busy medieval kitchen, one can imagine a weary cook staring at a piece of dried cod, reaching for a hammer, and wondering whether perhaps cabbage would have been easier. The answer, surprisingly, was yes. Unfortunately, the medieval cookbook was nowhere near finished finding new ways to challenge the human appetite. By this point, you might be wondering whether medieval cooks actually enjoyed subtle flavours. The answer is wonderfully simple. No. If a sauce didn't make your eyes water, or briefly convince you that you had inhaled it by mistake, many medieval diners probably considered it a little disappointing. Few condiments demonstrate this better than medieval mustard. Unlike the smooth, mild mustard found in many modern kitchens, medieval mustard was an entirely different creature. Cooks ground black or brown mustard seeds into a coarse powder, using heavy stone mortars. They then mixed it with vinegar, verjuice made from unripe grapes, strong ale, or wine. Depending on the household, they might also add ginger, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, garlic, or honey. The final result wasn't simply spicy, it was enthusiastic. One spoonful could clear your sinuses so efficiently that medieval physicians might have considered it a medical procedure. The popularity of mustard wasn't accidental. Medieval meat often lacked the freshness we expect today. Animals were usually slaughtered in autumn, preserved through winter, or transported without refrigeration. Even perfectly edible meat could develop flavours that benefited from distraction. Mustard specialised in distraction. By now, you've probably noticed that medieval cooks shared one philosophy above all others. If it could be eaten, it would be eaten. If there was any debate about whether it could be eaten, someone would probably try anyway. Nothing illustrates this better than blood sausage. The idea sounds alarming to many modern diners, but throughout medieval Europe, using fresh animal blood after slaughter was perfectly ordinary. Livestock represented enormous investments of time, labour and money. Throwing away a nutritious ingredient simply because it looked unsettling would have seemed almost irresponsible. The pig had already made its sacrifice. The least everyone could do was be thorough. The process began immediately after slaughter. Fresh blood was collected in large bowls and stirred constantly to prevent it from clotting. Cooks then mixed it with oats, barley, breadcrumbs, onions, garlic, herbs, animal fat, and whatever spices the household could afford. Pepper, if you were wealthy. Parsley, if you were practical. Optimism, if you were poor. The mixture was carefully stuffed into cleaned animal intestines, tied into long sausages, and gently simmered until firm. Some were eaten immediately. Others were smoked or lightly dried so they could last longer. Fresh from the pot, blood sausage had a rich, earthy flavour, unlike almost anything else on the medieval table. The onions added sweetness, herbs provided freshness, and the grains helped soften the dense texture. The appearance, however, required a certain amount of confidence. Imagine slicing into what looks remarkably like a piece of polished mahogany and enthusiastically announcing, "You simply must try this." Not every guest would have shared your excitement. Blood itself occupied a curious place in medieval medicine. According to the theory of the four humours, blood symbolised warmth and vitality. While physicians disagreed about exactly who should eat it and in what quantity, many believed blood-based foods could restore strength after illness or hard labour. Whether this was scientifically accurate is another matter entirely. After all, medieval doctors also believed your personality might be influenced by an excess of yellow bile. Blood sausage became especially popular after autumn slaughter season. Families preserved as much meat as possible before winter, turning every usable part of the animal into food. Hams were salted, fat became lard, bones flavoured soups, skins found new purposes, and blood became sausage. Waste was the true enemy. This practical mindset explains why blood sausage survived for centuries. It was inexpensive, filling, nutritious, and remarkably efficient. In fact, versions of it are still enjoyed today across Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Poland, and many other countries. Modern recipes, however, usually benefit from better seasoning, careful preparation, and refrigeration. 3 advantages medieval kitchens would have accepted with grateful disbelief. Still, compared with several recipes waiting ahead, blood sausage almost begins to sound sensible. At least everyone knew exactly what ingredient made people nervous. The next medieval specialty managed to disguise its unpleasant surprises beneath a generous layer of sauce, proving once again that if enough vinegar and spices were involved, almost anything could be presented as fine dining. After blood sausage, perhaps a simple fish dish sounds like a welcome return to familiar waters. The medieval cook agreed, then reached for an entire jug of vinegar. To modern diners, vinegar is usually a supporting actor. A splash in a salad dressing, a little in a pickle, perhaps a drizzle over fish and chips if you're feeling adventurous. In the Middle Ages, vinegar often considered itself the main character. One of the most common fish dishes across medieval Europe involved simmering freshwater fish such as pike, carp, perch, or trout in a sauce made with vinegar, onions, herbs, and a surprising amount of imported spices. Wealthy kitchens might also include wine, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, or sugar. The goal was balance. The result occasionally felt more like surrender. Strong, sour flavours were enormously fashionable during the Middle Ages. Medieval people enjoyed combinations of sweet, sour, salty and spicy, all in the same mouthful. While modern European cooking often separates those flavours, medieval chefs enthusiastically invited them all to the same dinner party. No one asked whether they got along. Vinegar also served a practical purpose. Fresh fish spoiled quickly, especially during warm weather. Although vinegar could not magically rescue rotten food, its sharp acidity helped preserve cooked dishes for a little longer and masked minor changes in flavour. To be clear, medieval cooks weren't trying to deceive anyone. They simply lived in a world without refrigerators, where dinner occasionally had a very limited schedule. Cooking began by gently simmering the fish rather than frying it. Once tender, it was covered in a sauce thickened with breadcrumbs or ground almonds. The vinegar provided a sharp bite, while onions softened its edge. Wealthy households finished the dish with expensive spices imported from Asia, transforming a simple river fish into something worthy of a noble's banquet, or at least worthy of someone who genuinely enjoyed vinegar. The smell alone filled medieval kitchens. Imagine walking into a great hall expecting roasted meat and fresh bread, only to discover that someone had apparently seasoned the air itself. Your eyes might begin watering before the meal officially started. According to medieval physicians, sour foods help stimulate digestion and balance certain bodily humours, especially after eating rich meats. Vinegar, therefore, wasn't merely seasoning, it was practically healthcare. Conveniently, it also made ordinary ingredients seem more sophisticated. Cookbooks from England, France, Germany and Italy all contain variations of these sharp fish sauces, proving this wasn't an isolated culinary experiment. Europe collectively decided that if one spoonful of vinegar tasted refreshing, several cups would surely be even better. History suggests otherwise. Still, many medieval diners genuinely loved these recipes. Their palates had grown accustomed to bold contrasts that seem unusual today. A sweet and sour fish stew represented elegance, wealth, and refined taste. To modern mouths, however, the experience might feel less like enjoying seafood and more like accidentally taking a very committed sip of pickling liquid. Surprisingly, medieval cooks were still not finished proving that almost any ingredient could become dinner, as long as you were willing to be extraordinarily open-minded. By now, you've probably accepted one important truth about medieval cooking. If an animal existed, medieval cooks considered every single part of it a valuable ingredient. Nothing demonstrated that philosophy quite like marrow pudding. Despite its comforting name, this was not the sort of pudding served after dinner with fresh berries and cream. Medieval pudding simply referred to a mixture of ingredients bound together, cooked slowly, and often stuffed into a casing or baked inside a crust. Dessert would have been a pleasant surprise. Instead, marrow pudding began with bones. After cattle or sheep were butchered, cooks split the large leg bones with heavy axes to reach the rich, buttery marrow hidden inside. Today, roasted bone marrow appears on the menus of fashionable restaurants. Medieval cooks looked at it and thought, "Wonderful. Now let's make it considerably stranger." The soft marrow was scraped into a bowl and mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, herbs, animal fat, pepper, ginger, and sometimes dried fruits such as raisins. Wealthier kitchens added saffron or expensive spices to announce that this particular collection of leftovers had become something respectable. Everything was stirred together until it formed a thick paste. A surprisingly enthusiastic paste. The mixture was then packed into cleaned intestines or baked inside pastry before being slowly cooked over the fire. The finished pudding was incredibly rich. Imagine spreading butter onto a slice of bread. Now imagine the butter itself deciding it could use a little more butter. That comes surprisingly close. The texture divided opinions. Some described it as smooth and luxurious, while others found it heavy enough to make a short afternoon nap feel less like a choice and more like medical advice. Of course, medieval people valued richness. Hard physical labour demanded enormous amounts of energy, and foods packed with fat were highly prized, especially during winter. A single serving of marrow pudding could provide calories that a farm labourer would quickly burn before sunset. Modern office workers, on the other hand, might burn those calories sometime around Thursday. Physicians also viewed marrow favourably. According to medieval medicine, it nourished the body, restored strength, and helped those recovering from illness. Fat was not something to avoid, it was something to celebrate. This practical attitude reflected a larger reality of medieval life. Food shortages were common, livestock required tremendous effort to raise, and wasting edible ingredients bordered on foolishness. Bones flavoured soups, skins became leather, fat produced candles and cooking grease, and marrow became another satisfying meal. Very little went unused. To modernise, the recipe may seem unusual, but the underlying logic was remarkably sensible. Medieval families transformed what others might discard into valuable nourishment. The only questionable decision was calling it pudding. Centuries later, that single word continues to lure unsuspecting readers into imagining something sweet before introducing them to a warm bowl of seasoned bone fat. Still, compared with the recipe waiting in the next chapter, marrow pudding almost sounds comforting. Because medieval cheese was about to prove that smell and reputation were often very different things. After a hearty serving of marrow pudding, you might hope the next course would be something simple. Perhaps a little cheese. A perfectly reasonable request. Until you discover that medieval cheese often seemed to regard freshness as a personal insult. Cheese was one of the most important foods in medieval Europe. It transformed milk, which spoiled within days, into something that could feed a household for weeks or even months. Farmers made it from cow's milk, sheep's milk, or goat's milk, depending on the region. Every village had its own methods, every monastery had its own recipes, and every cheesemaker believed everyone else was doing it incorrectly. Some debates never change. Fresh cheeses certainly existed, but the varieties that impressed people were often the oldest and strongest. Wheels of cheese sat in cool cellars, slowly drying, aging, and developing increasingly powerful aromas. A well-aged cheese was considered a mark of patience and skill. To modern noses, it could also be considered a remarkably effective way to clear a room. The smell came from perfectly natural bacteria and moulds breaking down fats and proteins inside the cheese. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they knew one thing. The stronger the smell, the more interesting the cheese. Some cheeses became so hard with age that cooks grated them into soups and pottages. Others remained soft, but developed flavours that ranged from pleasantly nutty to aggressively unforgettable. A traveller entering a medieval pantry might have wondered whether someone had forgotten to remove something several weeks earlier. The answer was no. That was tonight's appetizer. Cheese rarely appeared alone. It was commonly served with coarse bread, onions, apples, pears, walnuts, or honey. Wealthier households paired it with wine, while monasteries often enjoyed cheese during periods when meat was restricted by the church. For peasants, cheese was an everyday necessity. For nobles, the finest aged cheeses became symbols of refinement. Interestingly, medieval physicians had mixed opinions about cheese. Some praised young, fresh cheese as nourishing and easy to digest. Others warned that heavily aged cheese could slow digestion, create excessive phlegm, or upset the body's balance of humours. Considering some of the stronger varieties, one suspects the physicians had conducted extensive personal research. Cheese also played an important role for travellers. It kept well, required no cooking, and packed a great deal of nutrition into a relatively small package. A merchant crossing Europe or a pilgrim walking to a distant shrine could carry cheese far more easily than fresh meat. The only challenge came when sharing accommodations. Your fellow travellers always knew exactly who had packed the cheese. Despite its intimidating aroma, medieval cheese was genuinely delicious to those accustomed to it. Taste changes across cultures and centuries. Foods that seem overwhelming to one generation become treasured delicacies to another. After all, someone once looked at a wheel of aging milk, noticed it had developed a smell capable of alarming nearby livestock, and confidently declared, "It's finally ready." And somehow they were probably right. Still, our final medieval recipe is perhaps the most deceptive of them all. A broth that promised health, delivered bitterness, and somehow convinced generations of people that medicine and dinner should arrive in the very same bowl. By the late Middle Ages, people firmly believed that food and medicine belonged together, sometimes a little too closely. If you visited a medieval household feeling under the weather, there was a good chance someone would hand you a steaming bowl of herb broth with complete confidence. They were trying to help. Your taste buds simply happened to become collateral damage. Unlike today's comforting chicken soup, medicinal herb broths were built around plants chosen not for flavour, but for their supposed healing powers. Medieval cooks and physicians reached for herbs like rue, wormwood, hyssop, horehound, sage, fennel, yarrow, and sometimes even tansy. Most of these herbs were intensely bitter, sharply aromatic, or both. The guiding principle was surprisingly straightforward. If it tasted pleasant, it probably wasn't powerful enough. Wormwood was especially famous. Today it is best known as one of the ingredients used to make absinthe, but medieval healers valued it for entirely different reasons. They believed it strengthened the stomach, expelled parasites, improved digestion, and generally persuaded the body to behave itself. It also tasted as though someone had boiled an entire garden after it had developed a bad attitude. Rue was another favourite. Physicians prescribed it for headaches, infections, poor eyesight, and even protection against plague. Modern science has shown that large quantities of rue can actually be toxic. Medieval doctors understandably missed that chapter. The broth itself usually began with a base of meat stock if the household could afford it, or simply water thickened with onions and stale bread. Into this went handfuls of medicinal herbs, followed by garlic, leeks, parsley, and occasionally vinegar to balance the mixture. Balance in this case meant ensuring that no single unpleasant flavour dominated the others. They shared the responsibility equally. The result was deeply bitter, earthy, and powerfully fragrant. Honey occasionally softened the harsher edges, but only if the family could spare such an expensive luxury. Most people simply accepted the bitterness as proof the medicine was working. After all, nobody ever looked excited while swallowing something effective. Medieval medicine rested upon the theory of the four humours. Physicians believed illness resulted from imbalances within the body, and every herb possessed warming, cooling, drying, or moistening qualities capable of restoring harmony. Whether the patient enjoyed dinner was considered a secondary concern. Monasteries became masters of medicinal gardening, cultivating dozens of herbs in carefully organised plots. Monks copied ancient medical texts, experimented with remedies, and prepared countless broths for sick travellers and fellow brothers. Some undoubtedly saved lives. Some probably inspired miraculous recoveries simply because patients became determined never to drink another bowl. Ironically, several herbs used in these broths really do contain useful medicinal compounds. Sage has antibacterial properties, fennel aids digestion, and garlic can help fight certain infections. The medieval physicians were not entirely wrong. They simply lacked the modern ability to separate effective medicine from ingredients that made every spoonful feel like a personal challenge. Still, after enduring 14 remarkable recipes, our medieval feast has reached its final table, and fittingly, the last course will gather everything we've learned into one unforgettable banquet, one where the greatest achievement may simply be leaving the table still hungry enough to appreciate modern cooking. And so, after 14 unforgettable recipes, you've finally reached the grand banquet. Congratulations. Your reward is that they're serving all of them. Picture yourself entering the great hall of a wealthy lord sometime during the 14th century. Long oak tables stretch from one end of the room to the other, beneath flickering candles and smoking torches. Minstrels play cheerful melodies while servants hurry between benches carrying enormous platters. The room smells of roasted meat, wood smoke, wine, spices, and one or two things you're not entirely sure should have a smell at all. The first dish arrives, lamprey pie, its golden crust hiding the famous jawless fish swimming in a rich sauce of wine, blood, and spices. Before you have quite processed what you're eating, another servant places salted herring beside your trencher, followed immediately by slices of blood sausage, a bowl of garlic pottage, and thick wedges of powerfully aged cheese. Medieval hospitality believed in generosity. Your digestive system quietly files a formal complaint. Soon afterward comes stockfish that required 3 days of soaking just to become technically edible. Cabbage that has spent so many hours boiling it has forgotten its original shape. Vinegar-soaked carp, marrow pudding, and enough mustard to temporarily disconnect your sense of smell from the rest of your body. Someone then politely asks whether you would like more. You suddenly understand why medieval banquets often lasted for hours. Recovery time was built into the schedule. Yet here's the remarkable thing. To the people sitting around you, this was not a bizarre collection of unpleasant foods. This was luxury. Every expensive spice represented trade routes stretching thousands of miles. Every preserved fish reflected remarkable knowledge of food storage. Every carefully aged cheese demonstrated patience and craftsmanship. Every rich pie announced prosperity in a world where famine always lingered somewhere beyond the next harvest. Even the simplest cabbage stew represented security. It meant the family had enough food to survive another winter. The medieval table was never simply about taste. It was about displaying wealth, respecting religious traditions, avoiding waste, preserving food through difficult seasons, and making the absolute most of every ingredient available. Modern diners chase freshness. Medieval diners chased survival. When you view these recipes through that lens, they become far less strange. In fact, many still exist today in gentler forms. Blood sausage remains popular across Europe. Bone marrow appears in fine restaurants. Garlic soup is still beloved in Spain and France. Aged cheeses command astonishing prices. Even mustard continues to accompany countless meals, although most manufacturers now show considerably more mercy. Perhaps the greatest lesson from tonight's feast is that taste is never fixed. What one century calls delicious, another calls unforgettable for entirely different reasons. So the next time dinner isn't quite what you hoped for, remember the medieval noble proudly cutting into a lamprey pie before chasing it with vinegar fish, garlic soup, blood sausage, and cheese fragrant enough to intimidate nearby livestock. Suddenly, that slightly overcooked pasta doesn't seem so bad after all. Before there was a Netherlands, before Amsterdam's canals, before windmills posed heroically against the sky, and long before anyone argued about cheese with national pride, this land was something far wilder. It was a low, wet frontier of rivers, marshes, forests, dunes, and restless sea. The Rhine, Maas, and Scheldt did not simply pass through the landscape. They shaped it, broke it apart, fed it, flooded it, and occasionally reminded everyone living there that dry land was more of a suggestion than a promise. Villages rose on higher ground, on riverbanks, on sandy ridges, and on artificial mounds where people tried to stay above the water like sensible creatures, avoiding a very patient enemy. The people who lived here were not Dutch in the modern sense. There was no single kingdom, no national flag, no neat border drawn by officials with serious faces and clean sandals. Instead, there were many communities, each tied to its own land, leaders, cattle, ancestors, and river routes. Some were Germanic-speaking tribes. Others lived close enough to Celtic worlds and Roman influence that identity became less like a label and more like a muddy cloak. Useful, flexible, and probably in need of washing. Among the best known were the Batavi, who lived in the river delta and would later become famous as fierce fighters under Roman command. Near the coast were the Cananephates, neighbours of the Batavi, watching the sea and the empire with equal suspicion. Farther north lived the Frisi, people of the windswept coastal lands, where farming required courage, patience, and perhaps a mild personal grudge against the weather. There were also groups like the Tubantes, Chamavi, Chauci, and others whose names survive mostly because Roman writers had a habit of writing down the names of people they were either trading with, recruiting, taxing, or planning to fight. A charming system, really. Life here was shaped by water and survival. Cattle mattered, trade mattered, kinship mattered, reputation mattered. A person's world was not a country, but a web of family, village, tribe, and landscape. The marsh, the river, the forest path, and the coast were not background scenery. They were the walls of the world. Then Rome arrived at the southern edge of this wet northern land, bringing roads, forts, coins, soldiers, taxes, and paperwork, because conquest is never complete until someone starts keeping records. As the Roman Empire pushed northward during the 1st century before Christ, one tribe quickly caught its attention. These were the Batavi, a relatively small people living on an island formed by branches of the Rhine River, in what is now the central Netherlands. Surrounded by waterways and fertile floodplains, the Batavi occupied one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land in northwestern Europe. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Batavi were originally related to the Chatti, a powerful Germanic tribe farther east. At some point, whether through migration or political disagreement, they settled in the Rhine Delta. Their new homeland proved ideal. Rich grazing land supported large herds of cattle and horses, while the maze of rivers created natural defences against outsiders. If an invading army wanted to reach them, it first had to figure out which patch of water was actually a river and which one was simply yesterday's flooded meadow. Rather than resisting Rome immediately, the Batavi entered into an unusual alliance. Unlike many conquered peoples, they paid little or no regular tribute. Instead, they supplied something the Romans valued even more: soldiers. Batavian warriors soon earned an extraordinary reputation across the empire. They served as elite auxiliary troops, fighting everywhere from Britain to the Danube frontier. Roman commanders admired their discipline, courage, and remarkable ability to swim across rivers while carrying weapons and shields. Ancient writers even claimed they could cross swift currents alongside their horses without breaking formation. Modern military instructors might call this exceptional training. The Romans probably called it extremely useful. Their cavalry became some of the finest in the Roman army, and Batavian bodyguards were trusted to protect emperors themselves. For a tribe living on the empire's northern frontier, this was a remarkable position. Young Batavian men could travel thousands of miles, seeing deserts, mountains, and cities larger than anything they had imagined, before eventually returning home with Roman pay, foreign goods, and stories that undoubtedly became more impressive with every telling. Yet this close partnership came at a cost. Roman governors demanded more recruits, officers sometimes abused their authority, and imperial politics increasingly interfered with Batavian traditions. What had begun as a mutually beneficial alliance slowly became a relationship of growing tension. The Batavi remained among Rome's most valued allies for decades, but loyalty has limits. Before long, one charismatic leader would transform Rome's greatest northern partner into one of its most dangerous enemies, proving that even the strongest alliances can fracture when respect disappears. For years, the Batavi had been among Rome's most dependable allies. Their young men filled the ranks of elite auxiliary units, their leaders cooperated with imperial governors, and their homeland served as a stable frontier between civilization, as the Romans liked to call it, and everyone else, who naturally disagreed. But by the late 1st century after Christ, that carefully balanced relationship was beginning to crack. The breaking point came during one of the Roman Empire's most chaotic periods, the year of the 4 emperors. In the year 69 after Christ, Emperor Nero was dead, and 4 different men claimed the imperial throne in quick succession. Legions across the empire were choosing sides, generals were declaring themselves emperor, and Roman politics briefly resembled an extremely expensive bar fight. Amid this confusion stood a Batavian noble named Julius Civilis. Civilis was no ordinary tribal leader. He had served in the Roman military, spoke their language, understood their tactics, and even carried a Roman name, evidence of his family's privileged relationship with the empire. Yet despite years of loyal service, Roman officials had arrested him on suspicion of treason. Although he was eventually released, the humiliation left deep scars. At the same time, Roman commanders were demanding ever more Batavian recruits, often using intimidation and harsh methods to fill their ranks. Civilis saw an opportunity. Using Rome's civil war as cover, he convinced many Batavi that the moment had come to reclaim their independence. At first, he claimed he was supporting one Roman claimant against another, allowing him to gather forces without immediately provoking the full weight of the empire. Soon, however, the revolt became unmistakably anti-Roman. The Batavi attacked forts along the Rhine frontier, and neighbouring tribes, including the Canonifates and several Germanic peoples from across the river, joined the uprising. Roman garrisons found themselves surrounded, isolated, and cut off from reinforcements. Entire forts surrendered after long sieges, while others were burned. Even experienced Roman legions struggled in the flooded riverlands, where local knowledge often mattered more than strict military discipline. For a brief moment, it looked as though Rome might lose control of its entire northern frontier. Yet once the empire finally settled its own political crisis, it could devote its enormous resources to crushing the rebellion. Fresh legions marched north under the experienced general Quintus Petilius Cerialis. After months of hard fighting, negotiations replaced open warfare. The revolt ended without the total destruction of the Batavi, but their special status within the empire never fully returned. The Batavi had reminded Rome that even its most loyal allies could become formidable enemies when trust was broken. While the Batavi became famous through their relationship with Rome, another people farther north built their reputation by surviving an entirely different opponent. Their greatest enemy was not an empire, but the sea itself. The Frisi occupied the coastal regions stretching across what is now the northern Netherlands and into northwestern Germany. It was a beautiful landscape, but only if you admired places where the tide occasionally attempted to repossess your home. The North Sea was unpredictable, storms were frequent, and much of the land lay barely above sea level. Yet the Frisi refused to leave. Instead, they adapted with remarkable ingenuity. Long before medieval Dutch engineers became renowned for reclaiming land from the sea, the Frisi had already developed their own solution. They built artificial dwelling mounds known today as turpen, or weerden in some regions. These raised hills, constructed layer upon layer from clay, sand, sod and household waste, lifted entire villages above the reach of ordinary floods. From a distance, these settlements looked like small islands rising from the flat marshlands. During severe storms, when seawater covered the surrounding fields, the villages remained dry, while livestock and families waited patiently for the waters to retreat. It was an early lesson that in this corner of Europe, surviving nature often required more engineering than heroics. The Frisi relied heavily on cattle. Their herds grazed on salt-rich coastal meadows that produced healthy animals prized for their strength. Cattle represented wealth, food, trade, and social status all at once. Horses were also highly valued, and Frisian horses gained a reputation throughout the Roman world for their endurance. Fishing, hunting waterfowl, collecting shellfish, and trading along the coast completed their economy. Small boats travelled rivers and tidal channels, connecting distant communities that often seemed isolated on land. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the north, Roman goods from the south, and locally produced livestock all moved through these waterways. Like the Batavi, the Frisi eventually came into contact with Rome. At first, relations were relatively peaceful. Roman officials preferred alliances to costly wars whenever possible, and the Frisi agreed to acknowledge Roman authority while maintaining much of their local independence. That arrangement lasted only as long as both sides respected its limits. When Roman tax collectors began demanding tribute that exceeded earlier agreements, particularly requiring large ox hides of impossible size, tensions quickly escalated. What seemed to Roman administrators like a simple increase in taxation felt to the Frisi like exploitation. Before long, the peaceful relationship collapsed, proving once again that even on Rome's distant frontiers, greed could accomplish what armies sometimes could not. Southwest of the Batavi, along the wind-swept coastline of what is now South Holland, lived another tribe whose story is often overshadowed by their more famous neighbours. These were the Cananephates, a relatively small people whose homeland stretched across sandy dunes, tidal estuaries, and fertile river mouths. Though less frequently mentioned by Roman historians, they played an important role in one of the greatest uprisings Rome ever faced in northern Europe. Like many tribes in the region, the Cananephates probably shared close cultural ties with the Batavi. Roman writers even suggested they had similar origins, speaking related Germanic dialects and following many of the same customs. Their villages were modest collections of wooden houses with thatched roofs, surrounded by grazing animals, small fields of barley and wheat, and carefully maintained paths that linked one settlement to another across the marshy countryside. Life along the coast demanded flexibility. The sea offered fish, seals, shellfish, and trade opportunities, but storms could erase years of hard work overnight. Families learned to build where the land was highest and to read the tides almost as carefully as they read the seasons. Children likely grew up knowing how to handle small boats long before they were considered adults. Trade connected the Cananephates to distant worlds. Roman merchants sailed along the coast carrying pottery, wine, glassware, bronze tools, and fine jewellery. In return, local tribes supplied cattle, horses, leather, wool, and slaves captured during conflicts farther inland. Roman coins circulated through the settlements, though barter remained common. A sturdy cow was often worth more than a purse full of unfamiliar silver. The Cananephates also developed a close military relationship with Rome. Like the Batavi, many of their young men enlisted in auxiliary units, serving on distant frontiers throughout the empire. Military service brought steady income and valuable experience, but it also exposed tribal warriors to Roman discipline, politics, and ambition. When Julius Civilis launched the Batavian Revolt in the year 69 after Christ, the Cananifates became some of his earliest allies. Under their own leader, Brino, they attacked Roman forts near the coast with remarkable speed. Local garrisons, believing the frontier secure, were caught completely by surprise. Several forts fell before Roman commanders fully understood how widespread the rebellion had become. Although Rome eventually restored control, the revolt revealed something important. The tribes of the Rhine Delta were not isolated villages acting alone. When circumstances demanded it, they could cooperate across tribal boundaries, forming alliances strong enough to challenge even the greatest empire of their age. Their unity would not last forever, but for one extraordinary moment, the marshes and coastlands spoke with a single voice. History has a habit of remembering the loudest voices. The Batavi rebelled against Rome, the Frisi challenged imperial taxes, and so their names appear again and again in ancient texts. But they were far from alone. Across the forests, heathlands, and river valleys of what is now the Netherlands lived many other tribes whose stories survive only in scattered references, leaving archaeologists to piece together lives that Roman historians barely noticed. One of these peoples were the Chauci. They occupied the northern coastal regions stretching toward present-day Germany, where the North Sea shaped daily life as surely as it did for the Frisi. Roman writers described them with an unusual degree of respect. Tacitus praised the Chauci as a people who valued justice over conquest, suggesting they were less inclined to wage aggressive wars than many of their neighbours. Whether this reflected reality or simply Roman admiration is impossible to know, but the Chauci developed a reputation for stability and discipline. That did not mean they were weak. When circumstances demanded it, Chauci warriors launched daring raids across the North Sea. Roman records describe them sailing long distances in sturdy wooden vessels, attacking coastal settlements in what are now Germany, Gaul, and even Britain. These expeditions were not unlike those of the Vikings centuries later, although on a smaller scale. The sea that connected them to trade could just as easily carry them toward opportunity of a more enthusiastic variety. Farther inland lived the Tubantes. Their homeland lay in the eastern regions of today's Netherlands, where forests gradually replaced wetlands and sandy soils supported scattered farming communities. Roman inscriptions tell us that Tubantes also served in the imperial army. Auxiliary soldiers from the tribe have been identified as far away as Britain, guarding Hadrian's Wall and other distant frontiers. Imagine leaving your woodland village, only to find yourself standing watch in northern Britain, wondering whether the weather had always intended to be this unfriendly. Nearby were the Chamavi, Bructeri, and several smaller communities whose territories shifted over time. Tribal boundaries were rarely fixed. Alliances changed, families migrated, villages expanded or disappeared, and powerful leaders could unite several groups before everything fragmented again after their deaths. What united these tribes was not a common government, but a shared way of life. They farmed modest fields, raised livestock, hunted in dense forests, traded along rivers, and gathered in assemblies where free men debated important decisions. Leadership depended less on inherited crowns than on personal reputation, generosity, and success in both diplomacy and war. Together, these often overlooked peoples formed a rich mosaic of cultures. They may not have left behind great stone monuments or written chronicles, but they shaped the character of the Low Countries long before medieval counts and kings ever claimed the land as their own. Long before church bells echoed across the Low Countries, the tribes of the Netherlands looked elsewhere for signs of the divine. They found them in towering oak trees, quiet springs, mist-covered marshes, and rivers whose currents seemed to possess a will of their own. To the Batavi, Frisi, Canaanophates, and their neighbours, the natural world was not merely a place to live. It was alive with unseen powers. Unlike the Romans, they left behind no grand temples of marble or towering statues of their gods. Their sacred places were often open-air sanctuaries hidden within forests or situated near rivers and wetlands. Archaeologists have uncovered weapons, jewellery, pottery, animal bones, and coins deliberately placed into bogs and waterways. These were not accidents. They were offerings, gifts intended for deities or spirits believed to inhabit these places. Water held particular importance. Rivers connected villages and trade routes, but they also marked boundaries between worlds. Throwing valuable objects into deep pools or marshes may seem wasteful today, but to these tribes, it represented an act of devotion. A finely crafted sword or decorated spear offered to the gods was not being discarded. It was being entrusted to powers beyond human reach. Many of their gods remain mysterious because the tribes themselves left no written records. What we know comes largely from Roman inscriptions and later archaeological discoveries. The Batavi, for example, worshipped a goddess known as Nehelenia, particularly along the coast. Merchants and sailors prayed to her before dangerous voyages across the North Sea. Stone altars dedicated by Roman traders depict her seated with a basket of fruit, a faithful dog beside her, and symbols of prosperity and safe travel. Other deities reflected the blending of cultures that developed under Roman influence. Local gods were sometimes identified with Roman ones, creating hybrid forms of worship. A tribal war god might become associated with Mars, while a local sky deity could be linked to Jupiter. Rather than replacing native beliefs entirely, Roman religion often absorbed them, creating a spiritual landscape that reflected both worlds. Religion also strengthened communities. Seasonal festivals marked the harvest, the return of spring, and important moments in the farming calendar. Families gathered to share meals, make sacrifices, settle disputes, and honour their ancestors. Oral tradition preserved stories of heroes, spirits, and legendary founders, though most of these tales disappeared long before they could be written down. As Roman influence slowly faded in the centuries that followed, new beliefs would arrive from the south. Christianity would eventually transform the region, replacing sacred groves with churches and missionaries. Yet beneath many medieval villages, archaeologists still uncover traces of those much older traditions. Reminders that before crosses stood on the horizon, the forests, rivers, and marshes themselves had been the first temples of the people who called this land home. By the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, the tribal world of the Low Countries was beginning to change. Not because every village was conquered in a single dramatic campaign, but because generations of migration, trade, warfare, and diplomacy slowly reshaped the people themselves. The names that had once dominated the Roman frontier, Batavi, Canaanophates, and many others, gradually began to disappear from history. The Roman Empire was changing as well. For centuries, Rome had maintained forts, roads, and soldiers along the Rhine frontier. These defences had protected the empire from invasions, while also encouraging trade and cooperation with the local tribes. But maintaining such an enormous border became increasingly difficult. Civil wars, economic troubles, and repeated invasions stretched Roman resources thin. Garrisons were reduced, frontier towns declined, and imperial authority became less certain with each passing generation. As Rome weakened, new tribal confederations emerged. One of the most important was the Franks. The Franks were not originally a single tribe. Instead, they formed a loose alliance of several Germanic peoples living east of the Rhine. Over time, groups such as the Shamavi, Bruktari, Salii, and others joined together under this broader identity. It proved stronger than the older tribal divisions, allowing them to organize larger armies and establish more durable leadership. Many communities in what is now the southern Netherlands gradually became part of this Frankish world. This was not always the result of conquest. Families intermarried, villages merged, leaders forged alliances. Old tribal identities slowly faded as newer political loyalties took their place. The Batavi offer one of the clearest examples. After the Batavian Revolt, they continued to exist for several generations, but by the late Roman period, their distinct identity had largely disappeared. Their descendants almost certainly remained in the region, farming the same fields and living beside the same rivers, but they increasingly identified as Franks rather than Batavi. History had not erased the people, it had simply given them a new name. Farther north, however, the Frisi maintained a stronger identity. Their coastal communities remained relatively independent of Frankish control for much longer, preserving their language and customs well into the early Middle Ages. In fact, the modern province of Friesland still carries their name nearly 2,000 years later, making them one of the few ancient tribes of the Low Countries whose identity never entirely vanished. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the old tribal landscape had been transformed. The age of isolated river tribes was ending, and the foundations of medieval Europe were beginning to take shape. Soon, kings would replace tribal chiefs, kingdoms would replace confederations, and the story of the Netherlands would enter an entirely new chapter. Today, when people think of the Netherlands, they picture canals, bicycles, tulip fields, and cities that seem to have negotiated a peaceful coexistence with water. Few realize that beneath those modern streets lies the legacy of dozens of tribes who shaped this landscape long before the first medieval county or kingdom ever appeared. Their names may not be spoken every day, but they have never truly disappeared. Archaeologists continue to uncover their villages beneath layers of clay and peat. Excavations reveal the outlines of wooden farmhouses, storage pits filled with grain, animal pens, weaving tools, pottery, and the remains of carefully constructed turpen that allowed entire communities to survive centuries of flooding. Every discovery adds another piece to a history that was never written by the tribes themselves, but preserved in the ground beneath their feet. Roman forts along the old Rhine frontier tell another part of the story. Places that once separated the empire from the tribal north have become windows into a world where merchants, soldiers, interpreters, and local families met every day. It was never simply Romans on one side and tribes on the other. The frontier was a place where cultures blended, languages mixed, and identities constantly evolved. Many place names still carry echoes of this ancient past. The province of Friesland proudly preserves the name of the Frisi. Rivers that once guided Batavian traders and Roman patrol boats continue to flow across the country. Some modern roads even follow routes first established nearly 2,000 years ago, reminding us that history often survives in the landscape, long after people forget why a road bends where it does. Winter had tightened its grip on Scandinavia. The fields lay frozen beneath a blanket of snow. Daylight lasted only a handful of precious hours, and icy winds swept across the fjords with little regard for anyone foolish enough to be outside. Yet inside every Viking farmstead there was movement. Smoke curled steadily from the roofs of longhouses. People hurried between barns and storehouses, and preparations filled every waking hour. The greatest celebration of the year was approaching. This was Yule. Long before Christmas reached the north, Yule marked the turning point of winter. It was held around the winter solstice, when the nights were longest and the return of the sun seemed uncertain. To the Vikings, Surviving until this moment was an achievement in itself. Food stores had already been shrinking for weeks. Storms could isolate entire communities, and every family knew that the harshest part of winter still lay ahead. A successful Yule was both a celebration and a declaration that they had endured. Preparation began well before the feast itself. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered. This was practical as much as ceremonial. There simply was not enough hay to keep every animal alive until spring, so families selected which cattle, sheep, goats and pigs would provide meat for the months ahead. Smokehouses worked constantly, preserving cuts of meat that would last long after the festival ended. One animal received special attention: the pig. Roasted pork became closely associated with Yule because of the god Freya, whose sacred boar, Gullinbursti, symbolized fertility, prosperity, and the hope of another successful harvest when spring eventually returned. A magnificent boar placed at the center of the feast represented far more than a good meal. It was a wish for abundance in the coming year. Ale brewing was equally important. Weeks before the celebration, enormous wooden vats were filled with malted barley, water and yeast. Every household was expected to produce enough ale not only for family members but for guests as well. In fact, medieval Icelandic law later preserved older traditions by requiring farmers to brew ale for Yule. Failing to do so was considered both shameful and disrespectful to the gods. Running out of ale during the festival was perhaps even worse. It suggested either poor planning or an alarming lack of optimism. Meanwhile, women baked dense barley bread, churned butter, prepared dried fish, gathered preserved berries, and organised the household. Men chopped great stacks of firewood and repaired benches inside the longhouse. Everything had to be ready before the guests arrived. Because when Yule finally began, the work of surviving winter would pause for a few remarkable days, and the hall would be filled not with silence, but with warmth, laughter, food, and the promise that even the darkest night would eventually give way to the returning sun. By the time the shortest day of the year arrived, the preparations were complete. Across the snowy countryside, smoke rose from dozens of longhouses as families welcomed relatives, neighbours, and honoured guests. Travel during a Scandinavian winter was never easy. Frozen rivers became roads, snow covered familiar paths, and daylight disappeared long before supper. Yet people still made the journey, because missing Yule meant missing the most important gathering of the year. As the first guests reached the farm, hospitality took over. In Viking society, welcoming visitors was more than good manners. It was a sacred obligation. A traveller could arrive exhausted, cold, and hungry after crossing miles of frozen landscape. Offering food, warmth, and shelter was expected of any respectable household. After all, the stranger knocking on your door today might be the person saving your life during next year's trading voyage. Or, according to Norse belief, he might even be Odin himself, wandering the world in disguise to judge the generosity of mankind. It was considered wise not to gamble on the difference. Boots were stamped free of snow before entering the longhouse. Thick wool cloaks were hung near the entrance to dry, while the warmth of the great central hearth slowly chased away the winter cold. The fire burned almost constantly throughout the festival, filling the hall with the comforting scent of oak, pine, and roasting meat. Inside, every seat mattered. The longhouse was carefully arranged according to status and kinship. The chieftain, or head of the household, occupied the high seat, an honoured place often decorated with finely carved wooden pillars. His closest family sat nearby, followed by respected warriors, important guests, successful farmers, skilled craftsmen, and trusted allies. Even where you sat reflected your place within the community. It was rather like a family dinner, where someone had spent weeks calculating exactly where every cousin belonged. As more people arrived, the hall became wonderfully noisy. Children chased one another between the benches until adults reminded them that hot cauldrons and excited dogs made poor playmates. Hunting hounds wandered hopefully beneath the tables, convinced that persistence was a legitimate dining strategy. Conversations filled the air as news travelled from one valley to another. Traders spoke of distant markets. Sailors described rough seas. Farmers compared harvests and winter stores. Then the servants and household members began carrying in the food. Great wooden platters appeared one after another, piled high with roasted pork, beef, smoked lamb, fish, fresh bread, butter, and steaming vegetables. Large drinking horns were filled with freshly brewed ale, ready for the first ceremonial toast. The feast had begun, but eating was only part of the evening. Before long, every cup raised around the fire would carry a meaning far greater than simply quenching one's thirst. With everyone finally gathered inside the warmth of the longhouse, attention turned toward the food. This was no ordinary evening meal. A Viking Yule feast represented the richest table most families would see all year, the result of months of careful planning, preserving, and a little optimism that winter would not outlast the pantry. At the centre of the feast stood roasted pork. The pig held a special place during Yule because of its connection to the god Freyr, whose golden bristled boar, Gullinbursti, symbolised prosperity, fertility, and peace. In some traditions, important oaths for the coming year were sworn with a hand resting upon a sacred boar before it was sacrificed and shared among the guests. Promises made during Yule were believed to carry particular weight. Breaking one later was not merely embarrassing, it risked damaging both your honour and your reputation. In Viking society, those two things were often more valuable than silver, but the feast offered far more than pork. Large joints of roasted beef and mutton filled wooden platters alongside smoked lamb that had been preserved during the autumn. Coastal communities added smoked herring, cod, salmon and dried stockfish, while inland farms relied more heavily on meat from cattle, sheep and goats. Nothing useful was wasted. Marrow was prized, fat was treasured, and bones often found their way into rich broths once the celebration ended. Bread accompanied nearly every dish. Unlike the soft wheat loaves many people enjoy today, Viking bread was usually made from barley, rye, or oats. Dense and hearty, it filled hungry stomachs during long winters. Butter, soft cheeses, and thick curds provided valuable calories that were desperately needed during the cold months. Vegetables were simple but nourishing. Turnips, carrots, onions, cabbage, peas, beans, and leeks had all been stored from the harvest. Apples, hazelnuts, walnuts where available, and dried berries added welcome sweetness to the meal. Honey remained a luxury, but whenever it appeared, nobody complained. Seasoning was surprisingly sophisticated. Salt preserved meat, while herbs such as dill, thyme, angelica, mustard seed, and wild garlic added flavour. Imported spices existed but were rare and expensive, reaching Scandinavia only through long-distance trade. Most families relied on ingredients they could grow or gather themselves, rather than pepper shipped halfway across Europe. The meal was served on wooden trenchers and eaten with knives that guests often carried themselves. Spoons made from wood or horn were common, while forks had yet to make their grand entrance into northern dining. Fingers performed much of the work quite effectively, proving once again that complicated cutlery is not strictly necessary when confronted with an excellent roast. As satisfying as the food was, however, everyone knew the evening's true centrepiece had not yet arrived. Soon the drinking horns would be lifted, and each toast would bind together family, friendship, memory, and faith in a way that no feast alone ever could. As the first hunger faded and the platters began making their second journey around the hall, the atmosphere changed. The meal was no longer simply about eating. Now came the part of Yule that carried deep meaning for every person seated around the fire. The drinking horns were filled. Ale flowed generously throughout the feast, brewed weeks in advance from malted barley and flavoured with herbs that varied from region to region. Unlike modern beer, Viking ale was often cloudy, only lightly filtered, and could range from fairly mild to surprisingly potent depending on the brewer's skill. Every farm had its own recipe, and every brewer quietly believed theirs was the finest in Scandinavia. The first toast was never random. According to later Norse sources, particularly the Heimskringla, the opening horn was commonly dedicated to Odin, the All-Father, asking for wisdom and victory. Warriors raised their cups hoping for success in future battles, while leaders prayed for good judgment. Although many of those present were farmers rather than fighters, Odin represented far more than war. He was also the seeker of knowledge, the patron of poetry, and the god who had sacrificed greatly to gain wisdom. The second toast usually honoured Njord and Freyr. These gods were associated with peace, fertility, prosperous harvests, calm seas, and wealth. Their blessings mattered to everyone. Farmers wanted healthy crops, fishermen wanted generous catches, merchants hoped for profitable voyages. Families simply wished to survive another difficult winter. The return of spring depended, in their minds, as much on divine favour as on the turning of the seasons. The third toast often belonged to absent loved ones. Known in later traditions as the Minni, or Remembrance Toast, this was a moment to honour ancestors and those who had died. Names were spoken aloud so they would not be forgotten. Stories were shared about fathers, mothers, brothers, wives, companions, and fallen warriors. Laughter often accompanied these memories as much as sadness. A person truly disappeared only when nobody remained to tell their story. As the evening continued, the formal toasts gradually gave way to more relaxed drinking. Drinking contests naturally emerged. Friends challenged one another to empty horns without pause, while experienced drinkers confidently accepted wagers that seemed increasingly brilliant after the fifth refill. Fortunately, Viking longhouses were built close to the ground, making dramatic falls from chairs somewhat less hazardous than they might sound. Yet despite the generous flow of ale, Yule was not simply an excuse for excess. Every toast reinforced loyalty, friendship, family bonds, and shared belief. Raising a horn was an act of community as much as celebration. And once the drinking horns began circulating freely, another cherished tradition soon followed. As the fire crackled in the centre of the hall, voices slowly quieted, because it was finally time for the storytellers to speak. As the last echoes of the ceremonial toasts faded into the rafters, the longhouse settled into a comfortable rhythm. The fire crackled steadily, casting dancing shadows across carved wooden pillars, polished shields, and faces made rosy by the heat and the ale. Outside, winter ruled the darkness. Inside, another kind of warmth had taken over. This was the time for stories. In Viking society, entertainment was far more than a pleasant distraction. It was how history survived. The Norse left behind very few written records during the Viking Age. Instead, their past was carried in memory. Every generation learned the deeds of ancestors, the adventures of famous kings, and the exploits of legendary heroes by listening. A good storyteller could transport an entire hall from a snowy Norwegian farm to the walls of Troy, the forests of Sweden, or even the halls of the gods themselves. The most respected performers were known as skalds. A skald was far more than someone who recited poems. He was historian, entertainer, political advisor, and living archive all at once. His verses praised brave warriors, honoured generous rulers, and preserved important events for future generations. A skilled scold carefully chose every word, weaving together complex poetry filled with rhythm, alliteration, and clever metaphors known as kennings. Understanding every layer of a skald's poem required both knowledge and attention, making it something of a medieval puzzle wrapped inside a compliment. Many performances celebrated Odin, Thor, Freya, or the great heroes of old. Listeners heard tales of Sigurd slaying the dragon Fafnir, of Thor battling giants with his mighty hammer, and of Odin sacrificing himself upon Yggdrasil to gain the wisdom of the runes. These stories entertained, but they also taught courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and the acceptance that every life, even that of the gods, moved toward its destined end. Music often accompanied the performances. Simple instruments filled the hall with sound. Lyres produced gentle melodies, while bone flutes, wooden pipes, and drums added rhythm to the evening. Archaeological discoveries show that these instruments were common across Scandinavia, though singing remained the heart of Viking music. Entire halls sometimes joined together in familiar songs, whose melodies had been passed from parent to child for generations. Between heroic tales came lighter moments. Guests exchanged jokes, exaggerated hunting stories, and playful insults that drew laughter from every bench. A fisherman who claimed his catch had been nearly as large as a whale might find himself politely reminded that everyone else had also seen the fish before it became legendary. For a few precious hours, the darkness outside no longer mattered. The stories themselves became a kind of light, carrying the voices of the past into another winter and ensuring that neither heroes nor ancestors would ever truly be forgotten. By now, the feast had settled into its happiest rhythm. The platters were lighter, the drinking horns had been refilled more times than anyone cared to count, and the stories had grown steadily more dramatic with each telling. Outside, the winter wind still howled across the snow-covered fields, but inside the longhouse, nobody was in any hurry to sleep. The evening was far from over. Yule was one of the few times in the year when hard work could briefly give way to celebration. Fields no longer demanded attention. Ships rested on shore, and most journeys had been postponed until spring. For several precious days, people allowed themselves something that daily survival rarely provided in abundance: leisure. Games quickly appeared. Some families brought beautifully carved board games, many resembling Hnefatafl, often called the Viking King's game. Unlike chess, the two sides were unequal. One player defended a king trying to escape to the edge of the board, while the other commanded a larger force attempting to capture him. Victory depended less on luck than careful planning, and experienced players could spend hours anticipating one another's moves. Watching a particularly intense match often became entertainment in itself. Spectators offered advice that had not been requested, confidently explaining what they would have done several moves earlier. Fortunately, it is much easier to win a board game after someone else has already lost it. Children entertained themselves with simpler games. They played wrestling matches, tossed carved wooden pieces, balanced on logs outside if the weather allowed, or challenged one another to feats of strength. These activities were more than childish fun. Viking boys and girls were expected to grow into capable adults, and play often mirrored the practical skills they would one day need. Adults enjoyed contests of their own. Friendly wrestling bouts tested balance and strength without serious violence. Arm wrestling, stone lifting, and throwing competitions encouraged good-natured rivalry between neighbours. A successful farmer could compete with an experienced sailor, while an aging warrior might discover that young enthusiasm occasionally outweighed old confidence. The audience rarely minded who won, provided someone lost in an entertaining fashion. Gift-giving also played an important role during Yule. Unlike modern celebrations filled with brightly wrapped packages, Viking gifts emphasized usefulness and loyalty. A finely forged knife, a warm wool cloak, an embroidered tunic, a drinking horn, or a well-crafted brooch represented both generosity and respect. Chieftains often rewarded loyal followers with valuable weapons, silver arm rings, or imported goods, strengthening bonds that might prove essential during the coming year. As the games gradually came to an end and laughter settled into quieter conversation, the mood inside the longhouse shifted once more. The fire still burned brightly, the ale still flowed, but everyone understood that the most sacred part of Yule had arrived. The celebration was never only about food. It was also about maintaining the fragile relationship between people and the gods they believed governed the world. A successful harvest, healthy children, calm seas, victory in battle, and simply surviving another brutal winter were not taken for granted. They were blessings that required gratitude as well as hope. One of the oldest Yule traditions was the blot. A blot was a sacrificial ceremony performed to honour the gods and seek their favour. Depending on the wealth of the household or the importance of the occasion, the sacrifice might involve a pig, a goat, a horse, cattle, or other livestock. These were valuable animals, making the offering meaningful. Giving the gods something that cost you nothing would have been considered rather poor manners. The ceremony was usually led by the chieftain or another respected member of the community. The animal was sacrificed according to local custom, and its blood, believed to carry sacred power, was collected in large bowls. Evergreen twigs or specially prepared branches were dipped into the blood and used to sprinkle the altar, the walls of the hall, ceremonial objects, and sometimes even the people gathered inside. This act symbolized purification and divine blessing for the coming year. While modern audiences may find the ritual unsettling, for the Vikings it represented gratitude, not cruelty. Every part of the animal served a purpose. The sacrifice honoured the gods, while the meat became part of the communal feast. Nothing was wasted. Different gods received different prayers. Odin was asked for wisdom and victory. Thor was called upon to protect families and farms from danger, storms, and evil spirits. Freya received thanks for fertility, peaceful seasons, and abundant harvests. Njord was remembered by sailors and fishermen who depended upon calm seas and successful voyages. Even those who spent most of their lives inland understood that trade, wealth, and prosperity often arrived by ship. Ancestors were honoured alongside the gods. Many Vikings believed the dead remained connected to their families. During Yule, the boundary between the living and the unseen world seemed especially thin. Stories were shared, cups were raised in remembrance, and some households may have left portions of food or drink as symbolic offerings to those who had gone before them. As the final blessings were spoken, a feeling of quiet confidence settled over the hall. The community had shared its food, renewed its friendships, honoured its ancestors, and paid respect to the gods. Now only one thing remained: to greet the first light of the returning sun and welcome the promise of another year. Eventually, even the longest feast begins to quiet. The fire still glowed at the centre of the longhouse, but its roaring flames had settled into a bed of glowing embers. Empty drinking horns rested on the tables beside forgotten crumbs of bread and polished bones stripped clean during the night's celebration. A few determined storytellers were still talking, convinced they had one final tale worth hearing. Everyone else had found a place to sleep wherever space allowed. Yule was never just one evening. The celebration often lasted several days, sometimes even longer among wealthy chieftains. Guests remained together, sharing meals, repairing friendships, arranging marriages, settling disputes, and planning voyages for the spring. Winter had forced people indoors, but Yule reminded them they were part of something larger than a single household. When morning finally arrived, it came slowly. The pale winter sun crept above the horizon for only a few short hours. Yet that small change carried enormous meaning. The longest night had passed. The darkness had reached its limit, and from this point forward, each day would become just a little brighter. The Vikings understood that winter was far from over. Snow would continue to blanket the countryside for months. Storms would still batter the coast. Food would need to be rationed carefully until the first signs of spring appeared. But the return of the light gave people confidence that nature itself was keeping its ancient promise. Outside the longhouse, daily life gradually resumed. Farmers checked their livestock, ensuring the animals had survived the cold night. Woodcutters replenished the firewood stacked against the walls. Fishermen inspected frozen shorelines and boats resting safely on land, already thinking ahead to the warmer months when the sea would once again become their highway. Children, blessed with endless energy that ignored both weather and exhausted parents, hurried outside to play in the snow before being called back to help with chores. Visitors slowly prepared for their journeys home. Before leaving, they exchanged handshakes, embraces, and final promises to meet again when spring returned. Gifts received during the feast were carefully packed, while leftover food often travelled with departing guests. Hospitality did not end at the doorway. A traveller who left well-fed was more likely to remember the generosity of his host for years to come. Looking back today, it is remarkable how many Yule traditions survived the passing centuries. Feasting with family, decorating homes with evergreen branches, exchanging gifts, raising cups in celebration, gathering around warm fires, and filling long winter nights with stories all continued, even as Christianity gradually spread across Scandinavia. The names of the gods eventually changed, but many of the customs remained surprisingly familiar. Beneath today's Christmas celebrations still lies the shadow of an older festival, born in Viking longhouses, where people faced the darkest days of winter together, believing that as long as the fire stayed lit and the hall remained full of laughter, the sun would always find its way back. The Viking Age eventually came to an end, but Yule did not. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia between the 10th and 12th centuries, kings and missionaries faced a difficult challenge. They could attempt to erase centuries of deeply rooted traditions, or they could reshape them. More often than not, they chose the second option. It was simply easier. Yule was too important to disappear overnight. Entire communities planned their winters around it. Families gathered, debts were settled, marriages arranged, friendships renewed, and the darkest weeks of the year became a time of hope instead of despair. Asking people to abandon all of that would have been like asking them to forget part of who they were. Instead, the festival slowly changed. Long before the newspapers called him public enemy number one, before Chicago whispered his name with equal parts fear and fascination, Al Capone was simply another child growing up in one of New York City's busiest immigrant neighborhoods. He was born Alphonse Gabriel Capone on January 17th, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. His story did not begin with violence or wealth. It began in a crowded apartment filled with siblings, hard-working parents, and the daily challenges shared by thousands of immigrant families chasing the American dream at the turn of the 20th century. His father, Gabriele Capone, had emigrated from the small town of Angri, near Naples in southern Italy. Trained as a barber, he hoped America would offer opportunities unavailable in his homeland. His mother, Teresa Raiola Capone, was a seamstress whose days were spent sewing clothes while raising a growing family. Together they would have 9 children, and every pair of hands contributed to keeping the household running. The Capones settled in Brooklyn because it was already home to a large Italian community. Entire streets echoed with the sounds of Naples and Sicily. Italian bakeries filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. Neighbourhood markets sold familiar foods from the old country, and Catholic churches became centres of community life. It was possible to spend an entire day speaking Italian without ever needing English. Yet life was far from easy. Brooklyn, at the beginning of the 20th century, was exploding with new arrivals from Europe. Apartment buildings known as tenements packed dozens of families into cramped spaces. Several people often shared a single bedroom, while entire buildings relied on communal toilets in the hallway or courtyard. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Outside, the streets never rested. Horse-drawn wagons rattled over cobblestones beside electric streetcars. Dock workers hurried toward the Brooklyn waterfront before sunrise, while factory whistles marked the beginning and end of exhausting shifts. Children filled the sidewalks, inventing games between pushcarts, shouting vendors, and laundry lines stretched from one building to another. Young Al grew up in this noisy, energetic world. His parents valued discipline, religion, and honest work. Like many immigrant mothers, Teresa hoped education would give her children opportunities she had never known. Gabriele expected his sons to respect authority and contribute to the family's future. But Brooklyn offered another education as well. Beyond the family home lay neighbourhoods where poverty mixed with opportunity, where ambitious boys admired not only hard-working fathers, but also the well-dressed young men who always seemed to have money in their pockets. Alphonse Capone was still just a child, but the streets around him were already teaching lessons that no classroom ever could. If home shaped Al Capone's values, the streets of Brooklyn shaped his instincts. As the Capone family settled into life in New York, they moved through neighbourhoods that were changing almost by the month. Red Hook, Carroll Gardens, and the areas surrounding the Brooklyn Navy Yard were crowded with immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Every block seemed to have its own language, traditions, and unwritten rules. For a young boy, it was an exciting place to grow up. The docks buzzed with activity from dawn until dusk. Cargo ships unloaded coffee, fruit, machinery, and textiles from around the world. Longshoremen wrestled heavy crates onto the piers while tugboats whistled across the harbour. Nearby factories filled the air with smoke, and the constant rhythm of hammers and machinery became the soundtrack of daily life. Children treated the streets as their playground. They played stickball, marbles, handball, and improvised games using whatever they could find. Fire hydrants became gathering places during hot summers, while abandoned lots transformed into baseball fields. Arguments were settled quickly, friendships formed just as quickly, and every child learned to stand up for themselves. In neighbourhoods like these, confidence was often just as valuable as size. Al Capone proved to be an energetic and outgoing boy. Friends later remembered him as intelligent, funny, and fiercely loyal to those he trusted. He enjoyed making people laugh and was known for his quick wit, but he also had a temper that surfaced whenever he felt insulted or challenged. It was a combination that earned him both friends and enemies. The streets also introduced children to another reality. Organised gangs were already woven into neighbourhood life. Contrary to the dramatic images created by later Hollywood films, these were not yet sophisticated criminal empires. Many began as loose groups of local boys who protected their own blocks, fought rival neighbourhoods, and searched for excitement. Older teenagers acted as leaders, while younger boys looked up to them with admiration. To many immigrant children, these older youths appeared successful. They dressed well, carried themselves with confidence, and always seemed to have money despite working very little. A neatly tailored suit or polished shoes could make a powerful impression on a boy whose father worked long hours simply to pay the rent. At the same time, respectable adults viewed these groups very differently. Parents warned their children to avoid bad influences, priests preached about honest living, and teachers urged students to stay in school. They understood how easily a curious boy could drift from harmless street games into increasingly dangerous company. Young Al stood between those two worlds. Inside his home, discipline and hard work were expected. Outside, the streets offered faster rewards and a different definition of success. For the moment, he still attended school and returned home each evening, but the balance was becoming increasingly fragile. It would not take much to tip it in a very different direction. As Al Capone grew older, the gap between the world his parents wanted for him and the one waiting outside their apartment became increasingly difficult to ignore. Like millions of children in New York, he attended public school. Teachers quickly noticed that he was not unintelligent. Quite the opposite. Capone learned quickly when he applied himself, read well, and showed flashes of leadership that made him popular among classmates. Had circumstances been different, he might easily have followed a far more conventional path. But school demanded patience. The streets rewarded confidence. Those were two very different lessons. By the time Al reached his early teenage years, discipline had become a growing problem. He disliked taking orders, questioned authority, and found it difficult to hide his temper. His reputation among other students grew, not because he was the best scholar, but because he rarely backed down from an argument or a fight. The turning point came when he was around 14 years old. According to the most widely accepted accounts, Capone became involved in an argument with one of his teachers after being disciplined for disruptive behavior. During the confrontation, he struck the teacher. Whether it was a slap or a punch varies depending on the source, but the outcome was the same. His education effectively ended that day. He never returned to school. For immigrant parents like Gabriele and Teresa Capone, this was a bitter disappointment. Education represented one of the few realistic paths out of poverty. Every year spent in school increased the chances of finding skilled work instead of endless manual labour. Watching their son abandon that opportunity must have been deeply frustrating. Without school, Al entered the workforce. He accepted whatever honest jobs he could find. At various times, he worked in a candy store, a bowling alley, and as a cutter in a bookbinding shop. These were demanding jobs with long hours and modest pay. Most required standing for much of the day, while performing repetitive tasks under the watchful eye of supervisors. The wages helped support the family, but they offered little excitement. Each morning looked remarkably similar to the last. Work hard, earn a few dollars, go home, and repeat tomorrow. Outside those workplaces, however, another world continued to tempt him. Street gangs were becoming more organized. Illegal gambling, protection rackets, and small-time theft generated far more money than honest labor ever could. Young men only a few years older than Capone wore expensive suits, visited fashionable cafes, and seemed untouched by the financial worries that dominated immigrant households. To an ambitious teenager, the comparison was difficult to ignore. Leaving school did not instantly transform Al Capone into a criminal. It simply removed one of the strongest influences encouraging him toward a different future. With education behind him and few opportunities ahead, he began spending more time with young men whose ambitions extended well beyond legal employment. Among them was one man who would change the course of his life forever, Johnny Torrio. By his mid-teens, Al Capone had reached a crossroads. He still held ordinary jobs from time to time, earning an honest wage that helped his family survive. But the streets of Brooklyn offered another career path, one that promised faster money, better clothes, and a level of respect that many young men from poor neighborhoods struggled to find through legal work alone. Standing at the entrance to that world was a man named Johnny Torrio. Unlike many neighborhood toughs, Torrio did not rely on brute force alone. Born in southern Italy and raised in New York, he possessed something rarer than physical strength: patience. He viewed organized crime less as constant street fighting and more as a business. Gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and protection rackets all generated steady profits when managed carefully. Violence, in Torrio's eyes, was expensive. Negotiation was often far more profitable. This approach made him stand out. While other gang leaders built reputations through intimidation, Torrio built networks. He maintained relationships with politicians, businessmen, police officers, and rival criminals alike. He understood that influence could accomplish things that fists never could. Young Al found this fascinating. Capone had already developed a reputation for being fearless, energetic, and fiercely loyal. He was physically imposing for his age, but he also possessed natural confidence and an easy charm that made people like him. Torrio noticed these qualities long before the rest of America ever learned his name. At first, Capone's responsibilities were modest. He was not immediately entrusted with major criminal operations. Instead, like many ambitious young recruits, he performed small tasks that helped the organization function. He carried messages, watched entrances, escorted visitors, and learned how criminal enterprises operated behind the scenes. More importantly, he watched. Every day became an education. He observed how disputes were settled, how money changed hands, how loyalty was rewarded, and how loose talk could quickly become dangerous. Torrio rarely lectured. His lessons came through example, showing that successful criminal organizations depended on discipline as much as courage. One important stop in Capone's early career was the Harvard Inn, a Brooklyn bar and dance hall owned by gangster Frankie Yale. Despite its prestigious name, there was nothing academic about the Harvard Inn. It served drinks, hosted dancing, attracted large crowds, and occasionally became the setting for arguments that ended less politely than they began. Capone worked there as a bartender and bouncer, learning how to manage difficult customers while building connections with experienced criminals who passed through its doors. The Harvard Inn also taught him another valuable lesson. Power was not always held by the loudest man in the room. Often it belonged to the quiet figure sitting in the corner, saying very little while everyone else instinctively listened. Johnny Torrio embodied that kind of authority, and Al Capone began studying him carefully. Without realizing it, the young Brooklyn bartender was serving an apprenticeship that would shape the rest of his life. Working at the Harvard Inn introduced Al Capone to far more than unruly customers and late-night brawls. It brought him into contact with some of the most influential figures in New York's underworld, none more important than the men connected to the legendary 5 Points Gang. Despite its name, the gang was less a neighborhood street gang and more a criminal academy. Based in Lower Manhattan, the 5 Points Gang had grown from the rough immigrant district known simply as 5 Points, an area infamous during the 19th century for overcrowding, poverty, and violence. By the time Capone encountered it in the early 20th century, the neighborhood itself had begun to change, but the organization's influence had only expanded. Its leader, Paul Kelly, was unlike the stereotypical gangster. Born Paolo Vaccarelli in Italy, Kelly had changed his name to sound more American. He was educated, well-dressed, and surprisingly refined. He spoke multiple languages, boxed professionally, and preferred tailored suits over flashy displays of wealth. To many young recruits, he looked more like a successful businessman than the head of one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations. That image was intentional. Kelly believed discipline separated successful criminals from reckless thugs. Members of the 5 Points gang were expected to follow orders, remain loyal, and think before acting. Violence remained part of the business, but it was supposed to serve a purpose, not simply satisfy anger. For a young man like Capone, the organization offered something he had never experienced before. It provided structure. Older members taught younger recruits how to collect gambling debts, protect illegal businesses, and handle negotiations without immediately resorting to force. They learned that earning money consistently required organization, planning, and trust. A profitable gambling operation could generate far more income over time than a single robbery that attracted unwanted police attention. Capone absorbed these lessons quickly. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and willing to work long hours if it meant advancing within the criminal world. Unlike some recruits who dreamed only of becoming feared fighters, Capone paid close attention to how experienced leaders managed people and money. He watched who received respect, who gave orders, and who quietly controlled entire operations without ever raising their voice. The 5 Points gang also became a remarkable network. Among its members and associates were young men who would later become some of the most influential figures in organized crime across America. Many eventually left New York, carrying with them the methods, contacts, and discipline they had learned under Kelly's leadership. One of those men was Johnny Torrio. When an opportunity arose in Chicago, Torrio accepted it, leaving New York behind. Before long, he would invite his promising young protege to join him. Al Capone was about to leave Brooklyn for the first time, unaware that the next city he called home would transform him from an ambitious street recruit into one of the most notorious gangsters in American history. For years, New York had been Al Capone's classroom. Its crowded streets had taught him confidence. Honest jobs had shown him the limits of hard work alone. The 5 Points gang had introduced him to discipline, organization, and the unwritten rules of organized crime. But despite everything he had learned, Brooklyn was only the beginning. The next chapter of his life would unfold nearly 800 miles away. The opportunity came through Johnny Torrio. By the late 1900s, Torrio had left New York for Chicago, where he worked for one of the city's most influential crime bosses, James Big Jim Colosimo. Unlike the gang conflicts that dominated New York's streets, Chicago offered something much larger. The city was growing at an astonishing pace. Its factories, railroads, stockyards, and booming population created enormous wealth. And wherever large amounts of money gathered, illegal businesses were never far behind. Torrio quickly established himself as Colosimo's trusted advisor. He helped organize gambling operations, prostitution networks, and protection rackets into a remarkably efficient enterprise. Torrio believed expansion required dependable men, and when he looked back toward New York, one name stood out above the others: Al Capone. By this point, Capone was around 20 years old. He had also entered a new stage of his personal life. In 1918, he married May Coughlin, an Irish-American woman from Brooklyn. Their son, Albert Francis Capone, known to family and friends as Sonny, had been born shortly before their marriage. For a brief moment, it appeared that Capone might settle into a more ordinary existence. He had a wife, a young child, and enough legitimate work to support his family modestly. But honest employment rarely offered the financial security he desired. The invitation from Torrio promised something entirely different: greater responsibility, higher earnings, and the chance to work beside the man he admired most. Capone accepted. The move to Chicago was more than a change of address. It marked the end of his apprenticeship. In New York, he had largely followed instructions. In Chicago, he would begin helping manage operations himself. When he arrived, the city seemed almost overwhelming. Smoke poured from enormous factories. Elevated trains thundered overhead. Thousands of workers crowded the streets each day, while politicians, businessmen, immigrants, and criminals all competed for influence in one of America's fastest-growing cities. Compared with Brooklyn, Chicago felt bigger, wealthier, and far more ambitious. It also stood on the edge of enormous change. Only a few years later, the United States would outlaw the manufacture and sale of alcohol through prohibition. What many politicians believed would improve public morality instead created one of the most profitable black markets in American history. And standing beside Johnny Torrio, Al Capone was perfectly positioned to seize the opportunity. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago, the city already possessed a thriving criminal underworld. Gambling houses operated behind unmarked doors, prostitution districts generated enormous profits, and protection rackets reached into neighborhoods across the city. Johnny Torrio and Big Jim Colosimo had built one of the most successful organizations in America without relying on alcohol alone. Then the rules changed. In January of 1920, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act took effect, officially banning the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. Supporters believed prohibition would reduce crime, strengthen families, and improve public morality. Instead, it created an opportunity unlike anything organized crime had ever seen. Millions of Americans still wanted beer, whiskey, and wine. Restaurants wanted customers. Saloons wanted to stay open. Wealthy businessmen quietly stocked private cellars, while ordinary workers searched for places to enjoy a drink after exhausting shifts. The demand remained exactly the same. Only the supply had become illegal. Johnny Torrio recognized the opportunity almost immediately. To him, bootlegging was not simply another criminal activity. It was an enormous business waiting to be organized. Breweries could continue producing alcohol in secret. Trucks could transport it under cover of darkness. Speakeasies, illegal bars, hidden behind ordinary storefronts, could sell drinks at prices far higher than before. Every step of the process generated profit. Not everyone agreed. Big Jim Colosimo remained surprisingly cautious. His existing businesses already earned him a fortune, and he feared that entering the bootlegging trade would bring unwanted attention from federal authorities. To Colosimo, the risks outweighed the rewards. Torrio saw it differently. He believed refusing to enter the alcohol business would allow rival gangs to grow stronger, while his own organization stood still. The disagreement created tension at the highest levels of Chicago's underworld, tension that would soon have deadly consequences. Capone watched all of this closely. Although still relatively young, he had become one of Torrio's most trusted assistants. He helped oversee gambling operations, collected payments, supervised employees, and demonstrated remarkable organizational ability. Unlike the hot-headed teenager who had once roamed Brooklyn streets, Capone was learning how large criminal enterprises actually functioned. He also noticed something else. Money changed everything. The profits from illegal alcohol dwarfed almost every traditional racket. A single successful shipment could earn more than months of gambling revenue. The men controlling this new trade were rapidly becoming some of the wealthiest criminals in America. Capone understood that Chicago's future would belong to whoever controlled prohibition. He had come west as Johnny Torrio's student. Very soon, circumstances would force him to become much more than that, as a single murder at the top of the organization would completely reshape both Chicago's underworld and Al Capone's future. By the summer of 1920, the disagreement over prohibition had reached a breaking point. Big Jim Colosimo still refused to enter the bootlegging business. He remained convinced that gambling and prostitution already generated enough money without provoking the full attention of federal agents. Johnny Torrio believed the opposite. Every week they delayed meant rival organizations were claiming a share of what would soon become the most profitable illegal market in America. Then, on May 11th, 1920, everything changed. Colosimo walked into the lobby of his restaurant in Chicago, expecting an ordinary business meeting. Instead, an assassin was waiting. He was shot to death before he had a chance to react. The murder has never been officially solved, but historians have long suspected that Johnny Torrio ordered the killing. Whether Al Capone had any direct involvement remains uncertain. Some early accounts claimed he may have helped arrange the murder or brought in assassins from New York, while many modern historians find little solid evidence to support those stories. What is certain is that Capone benefited enormously from what happened next. With Colosimo gone, Johnny Torrio assumed control of the organization. Almost immediately, he expanded into bootlegging. Breweries were purchased or secretly reopened. Delivery routes stretched across Chicago and into neighboring towns. Warehouses became storage depots, while hundreds of speakeasies quietly served customers behind hidden doors. The operation grew with astonishing speed because the public had never truly stopped wanting alcohol. Capone became Torrio's right-hand man. His responsibilities multiplied almost overnight. No longer limited to collecting payments or supervising individual businesses, he began overseeing entire sections of the organization. He managed employees, settled disputes, coordinated shipments, and ensured profits continued flowing upward. Torrio valued something Capone possessed in abundance: absolute loyalty. Capone also possessed remarkable energy. He worked long hours, remembered names, solved problems quickly, and inspired confidence among many of the organization's younger members. Although newspapers would later portray him as little more than a violent gangster, those who worked alongside him recognized another quality: he was an effective manager. Unfortunately for Chicago, he was managing an illegal empire. As profits increased, so did competition. Other gangs wanted their share of the alcohol trade. Political corruption deepened as bootleggers bribed officials for protection. Police officers found themselves caught between enforcing prohibition and accepting generous payments to ignore it. Violence, once confined to smaller neighborhood disputes, gradually became organized and increasingly deadly. Johnny Torrio had built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America, but success made it a target. Before long, an assassination attempt would nearly end Torrio's life. His decision afterward would change American criminal history forever, placing the entire empire into the hands of the young man who had arrived from Brooklyn only a few years earlier: Al Capone. By the beginning of 1925, Al Capone was only 26 years old. Most men his age were still trying to establish careers or support young families. Capone was about to inherit one of the largest criminal organizations in the United States.